He found her at a shopping mall in West Los Angeles with a pitch that sounded like a dream. There was a role in the next James Bond film, a six-figure payday, and one small instruction about what to wear to the audition. A week later, the young woman who'd taken him up on that seemingly too good to be true offer was gone. The thing that would eventually undo the man behind the offer wasn't a fingerprint or an eyewitness to the worst of it. It was a habit, the same script, repeated to one woman after another for years, until the pattern itself became the closest thing to a confession anyone would ever get. Christine Johnson, or Christy to everyone who knew her, grew up in Saugatuck, Michigan, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. She was born in February 1981, graduated from the local high school in 1999, and spent a stretch at Western Michigan University before the pull of the film industry got the better of her. By the end of 2000, she'd relocated to the Santa Monica area, where she took classes part-time at the community college and chased work on real productions. She'd already gotten a taste of it, and in that year she landed a job on a Sandra Bullock film, though perhaps not in her ideal role in front of the camera. Some sources say that she worked as a production assistant on the set, while others claim that she was working as a personal assistant. Regardless of what she was doing precisely, one thing was clear. She was actually making some inroads to finding steady, paid work in Hollywood. On the other side of her Hollywood dream was a young woman who was close with her mother and her brother back home, the kind of daughter who called Michigan almost every day just to talk. That last detail mattered, because it's the reason anyone noticed so quickly when the calls stopped. Christy wasn't someone who'd drop out of contact or run off without a word, so when she went quiet, the people who loved her knew right away that something was wrong. On February 15th, 2003, Christy was at the mall in Century City when a well-dressed man approached her. He carried himself like someone important, a producer or a photographer, a man with connections to the Bond franchise. He told her she had exactly the look they'd been searching for, that there was a part in the next 007 film with her name on it. There was just one thing. To really sell it at the audition, she should turn up in a white blouse, a black miniskirt, sheer nylons, and stiletto heels. None of that was as bizarre as it sounds, and studios did, apparently sometimes, scout faces in public. To a young woman trying to break in, a stranger with a smooth line and a big promise wasn't automatically a warning sign. Christy bought a new pair of heels that very day, and she mentioned the audition to her roommate. Then she went off to meet him, and that was the last anyone heard from her. In a small twist of fortune for investigators, Christy would leave the receipt for the heels that she purchased in her room, giving them an exact time to work with. When Christy's mother couldn't reach her over the following days, something unheard of for the two of them, she filed a missing person report on February 18th. Her phone records told an alarming story. Her final call had gone out at 5:34 in the evening on the 15th. The signal had bounced off a cell tower in Studio City, right at the foot of the Hollywood Hills, and after that there was nothing. For a conscientious young woman who phoned her mother daily, that kind of total silence pointed in one terrible direction. Investigators went to the mall where her roommate claimed that she met the producer and pored over the security footage. They found her on tape, alone, buying clothes, including those heels, the receipt for which was sitting in her room, but the man who'd made the pitch never appeared on camera beside her. Her roommate filled in what the tapes couldn't: the Bond audition, the wardrobe instructions, the promise of a fortune. Unfortunately, Christy hadn't informed her roommate where exactly in the mall the two of them had met, though given that it was 2003, security camera coverage was still relatively minimal. There was one more detail that really showed that this wasn't legitimate at all. When detectives looked into it, they learned that no new James Bond film was actually in production. The audition she'd dressed for and the role she'd been promised had never existed in the first place. A press conference went out with her photo and a picture of her car, but the tapes in the timeline only deepened the worry, rather than pointing anywhere useful. Then the case cracked open from a somewhat unexpected direction, and this was definitely disheartening for anyone who had hoped to find her alive. As Christie's photo and a description of her car hit the news, a woman named Susan Murphy came forward with a story that gave detectives chills. She'd been approached at the very same Century City Mall by a man claiming to be a producer, and he'd told her she could be a Bond girl. He'd dangled a six-figure sum, and he'd given her the identical shopping list: white shirt, short black skirt, nylons, and stilettos. He gave her a place to meet near the corner of La Cienega and Santa Monica Boulevards. Murphy had shown up without the outfit on, and when the man realized it, his charm evaporated and he grabbed her. Her boyfriend, who had suspicions about the whole thing, was waiting in the car, and he jumped out, and the man bolted. This mysterious man had called himself Victor Thomas, but a search for that name went nowhere. Murphy sat down with a sketch artist and helped build a composite that investigators pushed out to the media. Detectives went back to the mall footage, found a man who matched the drawing, and Murphy confirmed it was him. All the while, on February 24th, Christie's car turned up, parked at a hotel, and left there by a man, though it offered nothing useful. The break came on February 25th. A parole officer saw the composite sketch on the news and recognized her own parolee. His name was Victor Paleologus, a man in his early 40s with a long and disturbing record. For all the supposed polish, the producer with Bond connections was an invention completely unmoored from anything he'd actually done in his life. In reality, Paleologus was a failed restaurateur who'd spent years faking the credentials that made his pitch sound legitimate. The year before, court records show, he'd been handed a sentence of 8 years and 8 months on charges that included passing fictitious checks, burglary, and an illicit offense against a woman. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, he'd walked out of prison just 26 days before Christie vanished, despite the chilling nature of that last particular offense. He lived near the spot where Murphy had been attacked, and both Murphy and her boyfriend picked him out of a photo lineup. And here's the thing that should have made him easy to find. He was already in custody. 2 days after Christie disappeared, Paleologus had been arrested, trying to steal a luxury car in Beverly Hills, and he was sitting in the county jail. Detectives interviewed him, and he flatly denied knowing anything about Christie Johnson whatsoever, and for a while, that left them stuck. Another tip pushed things forward and slowly tightened the grip around Paleologus. A real estate agent recognized the sketch as a client he'd shown around in early February, a man who'd toured roughly 10 houses. All of them clustered near the area where Christie's phone had last pinged, and the client had made one request the agent never forgot. He'd wanted to stand inside a bedroom and have the agent listen from elsewhere in the house to find out whether shouting could be heard through the walls. He'd framed it as a question about how well the place was insulated for sound, claiming that he was serious about wanting privacy. The real estate agent found it incredibly odd, but of course being odd in and of itself wasn't enough to trigger him to do anything more. Detectives searched all 10 properties and found nothing that connected any of them to Christie. Then, on March 3rd, a group of hikers in the Hollywood Hills came across the body of a young woman in a ravine. She was identified by a hibiscus tattoo on her lower back, and her hands and her ankles had been bound. The coroner estimated she'd been there for roughly 16 days, which placed her passing right around the evening of that last phone call. Unfortunately, the weather didn't cooperate, and the recent rain had accelerated the decomposition substantially. However, despite the elements not playing along, the cause was determined to be strangulation, with evidence of a head injury as well. The decay was advanced enough that investigators couldn't determine whether she'd been subjected to other forms of assault, and there was no evidence tying Paleologus to her body. What they had against him at this point was a pattern, and they needed a great deal more of it to make an airtight case. If they attempted to prosecute him on what they had at that moment, there was a very real risk he could be found not guilty, given the case needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If that was the case, then double jeopardy rules would apply, and there'd be a serious chance that he would effectively get away with this crime. Detectives had a hunch that there were way more victims out there, and when they went looking for other women, the floodgates opened. 2 days after Christie was found, a woman who'd worked at a restaurant in the Century City Mall told police that Paleologus had approached her in late January. He came at her with the same Bond girl story and the same wardrobe instructions, and that the meeting he'd arranged had turned violent. By the end, investigators say something like 13 women came forward describing encounters that ran from unsettling to nearly fatal, and the trail stretched back well over a decade. Prosecutors would later lay it out in the sentencing documents as a near-continuous crime spree dating to 1989. That year, posing as a record company executive, he'd lured a 21-year-old to a hotel room, where, she said, he ambushed her with a rope and choked her. His ultimate goal of that attack wasn't known, because the moment he started choking her, she bit him with tremendous force and made her escape. He was acquitted of the most serious charges and pleaded guilty to false imprisonment, walking away with probation. The woman warned anyone who'd listen that he'd do it again and that someone would die. But sadly, no one listened. In 1996, he forced his way into the home of a woman he'd briefly dated and came at her with a ligature, and she drove him off with pepper spray. 3 weeks later, when authorities moved in to arrest, he barricaded himself inside a trailer with a hostage before surrendering. The hostage wasn't harmed, and Paleologus pleaded guilty to burglary and was handed probation again. Now I get why, in 1989, a court may have had some difficulty giving him a more serious sentence, because thankfully the woman fought back immediately. Proving what his intent actually was in that situation, beyond a reasonable doubt, would of course been somewhat difficult given her heroic defensive actions. However, this hostage-taking in 1996 seems like it should have been the moment the justice system said, "Put a fork in it, we're done here." This was a guy who attempted to strangle yet another woman, and when the cops came to get him, he took a hostage. The fact that he simply got probation for this, and was turned out back on the street to continue his reign of terror, is absolutely bizarre. In 1998, he approached a woman at a Hollywood bar as a Disney producer, scouting faces for a Bond promotion. He told her to wear a black miniskirt and heels to a closed set, then bound her ankles and tried to strangle her with a necktie. She thankfully got away before he could do the worst of what he had planned, and that one finally stuck, earning him some time in the slammer. One of the most unsettling accounts also came from 1998 from a woman who'd had a recurring role on a Star Trek series. She described being approached at a mall near Beverly Hills by a smooth, well-dressed man who introduced himself as a producer and floated the idea of putting her on a Bond poster. He told her to come to a house up in the Hollywood Hills, to park across the street, and to wait, saying he'd be watching from inside and would let her in when she arrived. He also told her to wear that same general outfit that he always told his potential victims to wear. She didn't trust it, and she turned up without the costume and brought along a friend who worked as a stuntman, just in case. They sat outside the house for about 20 minutes, no one ever came out, and eventually they drove away. She had no way of knowing how close she'd come, or that the same script she'd just walked out on would be run a few years later on a young woman who didn't get the chance to leave. In the end, he seemed to be rehearsing this sick act for over a decade, with only the names of the women he targeted changing and most of the rest staying the same. Personally, I suspect he did end up using a house in the area when he attacked Christie, but for whatever reason, the cops were never able to locate it. Paleologus was charged, with prosecutors signaling they'd seek the death penalty. His trial opened on July 13, 2006, and the prosecution had a problem, and they knew it. There was no forensic evidence, no confession, nothing physical linking him to Christie's death. Had the elements not taken their toll on Christie's body, the case may never have gotten to trial. But that wasn't the case here, and the defense decided to roll the dice. What the prosecution had were the women who had the misfortune of running into this disturbed monster over the course of the years. One after another, several of his earlier targets took the stand and described the same man running the same con. There was the producer act, the bond pitch, the costume request, and the rage when the fantasy didn't go his way. The deputy district attorney who tried the case said later that without those women, there likely would have been no case at all, and based on the evidence, I have to agree. After about 2 weeks of that testimony, the defense saw where it was heading, and the two sides struck a deal. Paleologus would admit to his crimes, and in exchange, the prosecution would take the big DP off the table. He pleaded guilty, and then, almost immediately, he tried to take it back, sending the judge an 11-page letter claiming he'd only agreed because he was sleep-deprived. The judge wasn't moved, and in September 2006, Paleologus was sentenced to 25 years to life. He kept insisting he was innocent, kept maintaining he'd never posed as anyone or forced himself on anyone. He later tried to appeal on the grounds that his own lawyer had pressured him into the plea, but the courts turned him down. For all the noise he made about his innocence, the case against Victor Paleologus had been built almost entirely by the women who'd refused to stay quiet. It was the ones who got away and remembered every detail who were able to secure justice for Christie. It was also the women who were ignored for years, who were shattered to see this monster end up with probation or a light sentence, who turned up in force. Christie Johnson would have turned 22 the week after she disappeared, and ultimately, I have to conclude that the entire system failed her. She chased her dream and thought this meeting was potentially her big break, but little did she know, she was walking into the clutches of a predator who kept being turned loose on society. As a bit of a postscript on this case, I have to question whether Paleologus may have been a serial killer. He'd been attempting to do what he did to Christie for over a decade, and just kept getting away with it, even though the women escaped. The women he was known to target weren't on the outskirts of life. They were all women whose absences would be noticed. I can't help but think he may have targeted more vulnerable groups as well. Groups that the cops are notorious for not investigating, such as addicts or street-level escorts. That said, I have to admit that there's nothing to suggest that these women were part of his victim profile. I just find it difficult to accept that he only succeeded in achieving his sick goal once in the entire decade he was actively hunting for victims. Anyway, even if he wasn't a serial killer, he was a convicted serial predator and a ticking time bomb regardless, and it's somewhat shocking to me that he was even out on the streets. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget that you can suggest a true crime case in the comments as well, either something that's solved or unsolved. Somewhere in the piney woods of southern Mississippi, there's a patch of dirt that two grieving parents once sifted through themselves. They were looking for a bullet the authorities had never gone out to find, and they found it. What that small piece of metal told them turned what was officially a tidy case into one of the most unsettling, unsolved mysteries the state has ever produced. Picayune sits in Pearl River County, down near the bottom of Mississippi, and Norman Ladner Jr. was born there on the 29th of May, 1972. By the summer of 1989, he was 17, and by most accounts he was well liked and popular with his peers. Norman Sr. and Charlotte ran a small general store in town, and the family also owned a sprawling piece of land. It was somewhere around 122 acres of pasture and thick forest, and that land was Norman's second home. He fished it and hunted it, and he knew its tree lines and its low spots, the way you only know ground you've walked since you were small. His parents trusted him out there alone, with one expectation that mattered more than any other. Norman was to be home by 7, and he never broke it. And that simple fact is the first thing that should bother you about what happened next. On the 21st of August, 1989, Norman told his father he was going hunting on their plot of land. Nothing about that was unusual, and he picked up his rifle, walked off into the family's acreage like he'd done 100 times before, and the day went on. Then 7 o'clock came and went, and Norman didn't return home as expected. For a boy who never missed that deadline, that fact would mean everything, and Norm Sr. went out looking for his son immediately. He searched the property as the light failed, working through the pasture and into the trees, and after more than an hour of it, he found him. Norman was lying on the ground with a single gunshot wound to the head. When his father knelt and touched him, Norm Jr. was already cold, which meant he'd fallen hours earlier, not long after he set out. Whatever happened in those woods had happened early in the day, and his body had lain there while the family went about its business, unaware. The Ladners called for help, and then they waited a very long time given the severity of what happened. It was somewhere around 10 o'clock that night before the law finally arrived at the property, hours after a father had carried the worst news of his life out of those trees. The law, in this case, came in the form of Pearl River County Sheriff Ulmer Lawrence Lumpkin. And as a total aside, if you made up a character by that name for a novel or a screenplay, I feel like audiences would think that it was a little too much. By most descriptions, the sheriff's investigation was thin to the point of being almost theoretical. Lumpkin came to the scene and he looked at the body, then declared it all a big accident. Importantly, he didn't collect any evidence whatsoever from the scene, and most controversially, he didn't even look for the bullet. The county coroner reportedly told Norman's father he was 90% sure it had been an accidental shooting as well. Then, within roughly a day, the finding hardened into something else entirely. The official ruling came back that Ladner did it to himself, and the coroner signed off on it. Almost nobody who actually knew Norman believed it, and by every account he was a happy, settled teenager, with nothing in his life that pointed toward such an act. There was no note, and the people closest to him couldn't tell a story that made the ruling fit, since he had no signs of any internal or external turmoil whatsoever. I will say, of course, to play devil's advocate for a moment, that since this case was never really properly investigated, there may have been more there, but there's no evidence of it. And then there were the physical details that the findings simply didn't account for, the sort of stuff you seem to see happen a lot in these small town cases. By the coroner's account, the fatal wound was a close contact shot that entered at the right temple and passed out the left. But there was also a laceration on the top of Norman's head, a cut more than an inch long, sitting up near the crown, that couldn't be accounted for at all. When pressed, the sheriff offered an explanation that strained belief, suggesting the cut probably came from Norman's head, striking a tree root at the scene as he fell. Now here's the thing. If the scene had been properly investigated, there may have been some sort of evidence to suggest this. But as far as I can tell from my research, this was just a weird theory that Lumpkin tossed out that wasn't backed by evidence whatsoever. You would think that if Norm's head struck a tree root so severely and in such a way, there may have been some sort of biological material on the tree root. Instead, we don't even have proof that a tree root existed in that spot where Norm fell, which would clearly cause a major problem with this hypothesis. To me, it sounds like Lumpkin was just shooting from the hip, wanting to shut this case down as fast as possible. Whether that was due to laziness, incompetence, a genuine belief in his position, or something more sinister, has been argued about for almost 4 decades now. Norman Sr. kept circling back to the same problem with that bizarre hypothesis. The cut sat right at the peak of his son's head, and a boy who'd taken a shot to the temple and dropped straight back had no reason to come down on the crown. And there was the matter of the bullet, the thing that by any standard should have anchored the entire investigation. According to the family, the weapon was never dusted for fingerprints, and no real effort was made to recover the round that had ended their son's life. Picture that for a second. A 17-year-old is found shot on his family's property, and the investigators don't lift a print off the weapon or dig around for the bullet. Perhaps the most basic question in any shooting, "Where's the bullet?" was left for 2 heartbroken parents to answer on their own, and so answer it they did. Unable to accept the ruling and getting nothing from the people they theoretically trusted to investigate, Norm and Charlotte began working the case themselves. They went back to the spot where their son had been found, and sifted through the soil where his head had rested. A couple of inches down in the dirt, they found the bullet. It carried dried blood and a single hair, and to them it looked as though someone had pressed it into the ground. Now you're about to see why the cops should have been the ones to find this bullet, and why chains of custody are an important thing. Then came the detail that's kept this case alive for more than 30 years. The bullet didn't match Norman's weapon. By their account, it was the wrong size, longer than anything the chamber of his rifle was bored to hold. A round that doesn't fit the weapon at the scene isn't a small inconsistency by any means, and it raised questions about why the bullet was never found. The Ladners handed the bullet to a state ballistics expert, and by the time it came back, they'd lost faith in the whole exercise. The expert couldn't even say for certain whether the round had come from Norman's weapon, but there was a complicating factor. The parents became convinced that the bullet handed back to them wasn't the one they'd sent off in the first place. Somewhere in the chain of custody, they believed, their evidence had been quietly swapped for something less inconvenient. This, of course, is a very serious allegation, and many at the time thought that it was completely off the wall. But as you'll see, there was more. Norman's wallet was eventually found, but it had been cleaned out. By one account, it had held around $140, and the cash was gone, along with his identification. Last I checked, theft isn't usually on the menu when someone does something like this to themselves. But then the Ladners found the device, and here's where this case turns incredibly unusual. Roughly 300 yards from where Norman had died, there was a crude, homemade contraption that looked like a makeshift radio. The family didn't know what to make of it, so a neighbor pointed them toward someone who would. A former narcotics agent took a look and gave them an answer that recast the whole picture and suggested the hunting grounds had been used for something far darker. By his read, it was the kind of low-range signaling device drug traffickers use to guide aircraft, a beacon to line up a plane and tell it where to drop a load. If there was smuggling equipment tucked into the back of that property, then the woods Norman wandered every day weren't as empty as they looked. The emptied wallet starts to read less like a simple robbery than like someone working to muddy what had really happened. A 17-year-old who knew that land better than anyone could very easily have walked into the middle of something he was never meant to see. I want to be careful here because this is the point where a case can tip into pure guesswork and speculation. The device was identified, but the smuggling theory was never proven in any court, and state authorities waved it off as unimportant. Still, it sat there alongside everything else, and it's hard to look at the whole pile of bizarre evidence and just call it a simple run of coincidences. If the family had any doubt they were poking at something dangerous, a stranger removed it. While they were at the coroner's office trying to challenge the ruling, Charlotte was approached by a man she didn't know. He got her alone on the pretext of having something to say about her son, and what he actually delivered was a warning. He told her, in so many words, to leave the case closed, and she was gently reminded that she had other children. She was told that she should think about raising them and let this go, because she was never going to find the person responsible anyway. Then he walked off, and she never saw him again, or learned his identity, or even if what he said had any truth whatsoever behind it. The case drew enough attention to reach national television the year after Norman died, and despite an appearance on Unsolved Mysteries, still nothing shook loose. Years later, his missing identification, the same identification that had vanished from his emptied wallet in the Mississippi woods, allegedly turned up far away in New York City. How it traveled more than 1,000 miles from a patch of dirt in Picayune to the other end of the country, nobody has ever explained. That said, though, it remains unclear if this is just a local rumor that made it online in the decades following his death, or whether this is actual fact. At any rate, I can't find any primary source reporting on it, so I would treat it as improbable or speculative at best. Personally, I find this element of the case doubtful, but it pops up enough that I felt I had to address it at the very least. Norm Sr. and Charlotte spent the rest of their lives pushing against that ruling that Norm Jr. did it to himself. The official file, for what it's worth, was closed a long time ago, but the mystery of what happened to Norman Ladner remains. Personally, I feel like there's too much smoke here for there to not be a fire. But ultimately, the lack of a proper investigation makes any real firm conclusions impossible. And given Charlotte's encounter in the coroner's office and some of the general strangeness surrounding this case, many have argued that was a feature, not a bug. On June 8, 1806, an 80-year-old man lay dying in his Richmond home, his body ravaged by 2 weeks of unrelenting agony. But this wasn't an ordinary old man. He was one of the founding fathers. He'd signed the Declaration of Independence, and he'd personally mentored many great men, including Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, and Henry Clay. And now, with his final reserves of strength, George Wythe delivered a self-diagnosis that none of his attending physicians were willing to accept. He looked at the men gathered around his bed and told the men that he had been poisoned. To understand why Wythe's death sent shockwaves across the nation, you have to understand who he was. Born in 1726 in Elizabeth City County, Virginia, Wythe rose from a modest planter family to become one of the most consequential legal minds of the 18th century. He studied law under his uncle and was admitted to practice before the Virginia General Court at the remarkably young age of 20. He went on to serve multiple terms in the House of Burgesses, acting as its clerk for nearly a full decade. He represented Virginia at the Second Continental Congress and became the first of 7 Virginians to sign the Declaration of Independence. But Wythe's legacy wasn't built on politics alone. In 1779, he was appointed professor of law at the College of William and Mary, the first such position at any American institution. His students shaped the country, and Jefferson himself credited Wythe as the man who made him an honest and powerful advocate, both for his clients and for his country as a whole. John Marshall went on to become arguably the most influential Chief Justice in American history, while Henry Clay became one of the most powerful senators the country ever produced. By 1805, Wythe's household in Richmond consisted of 4 people. There was Wythe himself, still serving as a judge at 80. There was Lydia Broadnax, a freedwoman who'd been his housekeeper and cook for over 20 years. There was also Michael Brown, a freed teenager Wythe was personally educating. And then there was George Wythe Sweeney, Wythe's grandnephew, sent to live with the old judge in the hopes that some of his character might rub off. Sweeney was 17 or 18, and he was a disaster to say the least. He drank, gambled, and ran up debts at the taverns and gambling dens clustered around Richmond's seediest areas. When his money ran out, he started stealing, pilfering rare books from Wythe's library and selling them at public auction. Then he graduated to forging Wythe's signature on bank checks, at least 6 by the spring of 1806. Wythe, ever the optimist about human nature, forgave the thefts and even revised his will to ensure Sweeney would still inherit despite his personal crimes against him. Unfortunately, the will contained a fateful provision that would lay the groundwork for what happened next. If Michael Brown died before reaching full age, his share of the large inheritance would pass directly to Sweeney. On the evening of May 24, 1806, Wythe ate a light supper of strawberries and milk. The next morning, a Sunday, he took his usual frugal breakfast with coffee prepared by Broadnax. Brown and Broadnax also drank from the same pot. Only Sweeney, who prepared the coffee, didn't partake, and within an hour, all three were violently ill, doubled over with stomach cramps and severe nausea. Sweeney, despite having likely had everything else the others in the household had besides the tainted coffee, was totally fine. Richmond's most prominent physicians rushed to the home, and they initially suspected cholera, perhaps brought on by the strawberries from the night before. Wythe rejected this diagnosis immediately and insisted to anyone who would listen that he'd been poisoned by his grandnephew. The circumstantial evidence began piling up fast. 2 days later, Sweeney walked into the Bank of Richmond and tried to cash a $100 check bearing Wythe's signature. The teller, knowing Wythe was on his deathbed, contacted authorities. It wasn't the first forged check Sweeney had passed. When a constable arrested Sweeney, he felt 2 paper-wrapped parcels in the young man's pockets, but for whatever reason, he didn't confiscate them. Days later, a packet of arsenic turned up in the garden adjacent to the jail, as if thrown from a cell window. Inside Wythe's home, the situation grew dire. Broadnax slowly recovered, though the poison would leave her nearly blind for life. Michael Brown wasn't so fortunate, and he died on June 1st, just 1 week after drinking the tainted coffee. Upon hearing the news, Wythe summoned his attorney Edmund Randolph and signed a codicil disinheriting Sweeney entirely, redirecting his share to Sweeney's siblings. And you're going to want to keep Randolph's name in mind, because he would play a very bizarre role in the criminal trial, especially given his tangential involvement in the case. The old founding father lingered another week in excruciating pain, and on June 8, 1806, this founder of the Republic had slipped into history once and for all. Wythe's funeral at St. John's Church in Richmond was the largest Virginia had ever seen. Businesses shut down across the city, and thousands of mourners lined Main Street as the procession wound from the Capitol to the burial site. Newspaper coverage of his mysterious death captivated American readers throughout the summer and fall. President Jefferson's grief for his fallen law professor was profound and lasting. He called Wythe the purest character he'd ever known, described him as his best friend, and characterized the suspect as possessing a depravity previously known only in fables. Those close to Jefferson noted that his personality seemed to darken in the months that followed, even as his political fortunes remained strong. Sweeney was arrested on June 18th and charged with a number of offenses related to the poisoning. In the court of public opinion, Sweeney was already guilty as charged, and what happened next would ignite a firestorm of rage. Virginia Attorney General Philip Norborne Nicholas led the prosecution in what most expected to be a swift conviction. Witnesses testified that Sweeney had asked friends about procuring poison weeks before the incident. A friend said Sweeney had sought advice on obtaining ratsbane, a common arsenic-based rodent poison. The Richmond mayor, who took it upon himself to do some amateur sleuthing, found arsenic powder in a shed on Wythe's property. Doctors who performed autopsies on both victims also found severe stomach inflammation consistent with arsenic, again pointing to the nefarious Sweeney. But the prosecution's case had a fatal weakness that had nothing to do with the evidence itself. The most important witness was Lydia Broadnax, as she was the only innocent person who had been in the kitchen that Sunday morning. She'd watched Sweeney handle the coffee pot and toss a small white paper into the fire. She'd drunk from that same pot and nearly died. According to the later account of George Wythe Munford, the son of one of Wythe's law students and a man who knew Broadnax personally, she'd also witnessed something damning. Sweeney was rummaging through Wythe's desk and inspecting the will the day before the poisoning. Her testimony should have easily sealed Sweeney's fate, but Judges Joseph Prentice and John Tyler Sr. ruled that Broadnax couldn't testify. Under Virginia law, black people, regardless of their status, were prohibited from giving evidence against white defendants in criminal proceedings. Broadnax's first-hand account was excluded entirely, and prosecutors attempted to get around this using white witness hearsay. However, even white witnesses who'd heard her story couldn't relay it, because second-hand testimony originating from a black source was also inadmissible. The defense was surprisingly formidable. 2 lawyers volunteered to represent a man almost everyone in Richmond believed to be guilty. William Wirt, a brilliant young attorney, saw the high-profile case as a career-making opportunity. The other was Edmund Randolph, Wythe's own longtime friend and personal attorney, and perhaps the last person you'd expect to represent the accused poisoner. Randolph had fallen on hard times after resigning from George Washington's cabinet amid a political scandal and needed a courtroom victory to rebuild his reputation. Under cross-examination, the medical witnesses hedged their bets. One doctor conceded the symptoms could potentially be attributed to causes other than arsenic. Another physician admitted they hadn't performed the definitive chemical tests available at the time. On September 8th, after deliberating for only a matter of minutes, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. And to be fair, without the evidence of Broadnax, finding Sweeney guilty beyond a reasonable doubt would have basically been an impossibility. The Richmond Enquirer explained the acquittal bluntly, noting that the strongest testimony had been kept from the jury because it came from a black witness. Notably, no one questioned the veracity of what Broadnax was saying. This was simply a disturbing technicality based upon an unjust law that existed at the time. The story was reprinted in newspapers across the country, and public outrage was considerable. Sweeney was convicted on 2 forgery counts the very next day, but the sentence was never carried out. He left Virginia shortly after, and reportedly ended up in Tennessee, where he was eventually convicted of horse theft and spent several years in prison. However, there's an extremely bitter irony here that's hard to ignore, if we're going to assume that Sweeney was guilty. And just to be clear, based upon all evidence, including the evidence of Broadnax that was excluded, I personally believe that Sweeney was guilty. But let's get back to the irony of the result itself. Decades before the trial, Wythe and Jefferson had worked together to revise Virginia's legal code. They'd even discussed changing the rules governing black testimony, but Jefferson and Wythe decided the public wasn't ready for black witnesses against white criminals. The very legal framework that Wythe helped build became the instrument that let the man who almost certainly poisoned him walk free. In the end, Virginia didn't change these laws until 1867 under a Reconstruction government. Lydia Broadnax, the woman who could have delivered justice for her employer and friend, never got to speak in a courtroom. She lived out her remaining years nearly blind, struggling financially, until President Jefferson personally interceded and provided her a modest income to live on. Someone out fishing one spring day in the hills of East Tennessee climbed down toward the water near a highway off-ramp and found a young woman lying in the weeds. She'd been there about 3 weeks, and she had no wallet or anything else on her to say who she'd been or how she'd ended up nearly 900 miles from home. It would take 33 years, 2 of her brothers, and a tip about a completely different missing woman before anyone could finally say her name out loud. Elizabeth Lamott went by Liz, and in 1984 she was a teenager at the Youth Development Center in Manchester, the largest city in New Hampshire. This was a youth detention facility for young people who'd landed in the custody of the system for whatever reason. For Liz, the reason she was locked up doesn't appear to be clear in the records, but she was right on the cusp of aging out of the system. In either April or November of 1984, the records aren't clear, Liz left the detention on a furlough. A furlough was a fairly routine thing, a window of supervised freedom granted to a prisoner who'd earned it, and on paper it came with the expectation that she'd return when it ended. The plan was an ordinary one. She'd head to Gill Stadium, the old ballpark that sat in the middle of Manchester for the better part of a century, and then go back to the facility. But she didn't. What's stranger still is what didn't happen next. The facility didn't sound an alarm. When her 18th birthday came around in July 1985, her case was simply discharged on schedule, as though she'd aged out and moved on with her life. She hadn't. By then, she'd potentially been gone for over a year, and she was lying unidentified in a morgue in another state. No one in New Hampshire had connected those two facts because no one in New Hampshire had reported her as missing in the first place. Nearly 900 miles to the south and west, the rest of the story had already been written. On the 14th of April, 1985, someone who'd gone fishing near Greenville, Tennessee, spotted a body partially hidden in the brush off Interstate 81. This was less than 60 feet from the exit ramp at what locals know as Exit 44. She'd been found in a state of undress, and the weeds had grown up over her where she lay. It appeared that whoever brought her there had chosen that lonely stretch of interstate as a dump site. The Greene County Sheriff's Department and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation came out to a scene that gave them almost nothing to work with. There was nothing on her or near her that might carry a name, just the young woman and the ground she'd been left on. The remains were badly decomposed, which stripped away most of what an investigator would normally lean on. An autopsy put her death at roughly 3 weeks before she was found, somewhere around the middle of March. The medical examiner determined she'd suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and that a blow there had ended her life. Investigators checked the national databases for missing people, but of course, since she was never reported missing, this led nowhere. So she became a Jane Doe, one more unidentified young woman found near a southern highway in the early to mid-1980s. Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi had collected a grim cluster of cases just like hers in those years. These were women left along interstates and rural roadsides, several of them with reddish hair. Over time, those cases picked up a shorthand name among researchers and reporters: the Redhead Murders. Theories there have run in every direction, from a single long-haul trucker working the highway corridors to nothing more than coincidence and bad luck stitched together after the fact. Liz's case drifted into that orbit too, mostly because of where and how she was found. To this day, investigators are careful about how firmly they'll link any of these cases together, and whether she truly belongs in that group is something nobody has been able to prove. In 2006, the TBI sent a DNA sample from the unidentified Greene County victim to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. A profile was uploaded into the National DNA Index used to connect cases across state lines. It sat there, technically perfect and practically useless, because there was nothing on the other side to match it to. A genetic profile only works if someone, somewhere, has reported the person it belongs to, but for Liz, no one had. Genetic genealogy, for its part, wouldn't yet enter the scene for more than a decade, but this isn't a case that would be solved by this cutting-edge forensic technique. Her family knew she was gone, but the formal machinery of a missing person case had never been switched on. The years stacked up, and the case file in Tennessee stayed open, despite being cold. The break, when it finally came, arrived sideways and had almost nothing to do with Liz at all. In January of 2017, New Hampshire investigators held a press conference about an entirely separate nightmare, the Allenstown case, better known now as the Bear Brook slayings. They were trying to put a name to a woman who'd been connected to a man who went by Bob Evans, a suspected serial killer who'd used a string of false identities across the country. In the end, it would turn out that Bob Evans was an absolute monster by the name of Terry Rasmussen. For a while, the woman was known only as Elizabeth Evans, and the police wanted to know who she really was, so they turned to the public for help. Someone watching the coverage made a connection, and they remembered a girl who'd slipped away from the Manchester Youth Development Center. They wondered whether that girl and the mysterious Elizabeth Evans might be the same person, so they picked up the phone. The tip went to the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit and on to the Manchester Police Department. With that call, for the first time in more than 30 years, someone in an official capacity started actually looking for Liz Lamott. And I have to say here that this is one of the thinnest threads I've ever seen that's caused a significant breakthrough in a true crime case. A teenager vanished, no report was ever filed, and the thing that finally pulled her file into the light was a stranger's guess about Liz. Investigators spoke with people from the youth center and with Liz's own family and friends, who confirmed she'd been gone since 1984. They entered her into the National Crime Database at last, and 2 of her brothers gave genetic samples, and those went into the federal system for the missing and unidentified. On the 13th of November 2018, the answer came back. The lab in Texas matched the DNA from Liz's brothers to the remains of the unidentified woman found off Interstate 81 in Greene County in 1985. Her identity was made public the following day, and the tip that cracked it, the one about Elizabeth Evans, turned out to be wrong since nothing suggested she got mixed up with Rasmussen. What the identification didn't do was answer the question that surfaced the moment her body turned up off that ramp in 1985. Knowing her name tells us nothing about how a teenager from a detention facility in New England came to be lying beside a Tennessee off-ramp 5 months later. There's no record of how she got there, or who she was in the presence of in those last months. The middle of the story, the part between Gill Stadium and Exit 44, is simply gone. Filling in that story is much more difficult as well, given not only the passage of time, but the fact it's not even clear if she disappeared in April or November. One theory I keep coming back to is that Liz's disappearance may not have started with some random stranger on the highway. It may have started much closer to the place she was last officially seen. And to be clear, I'm not saying there's proof that someone from the Youth Development Center ended the life of Liz Lamott, because there isn't. But a lot doesn't add up here. When you look at what later came out about that facility, it becomes much harder to treat her disappearance like a simple runaway case. The Youth Development Center has since become the center of one of the largest youth detention scandals in American history. Former inmates have alleged decades of the most disturbing activities by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Some have claimed that the staff used fear, isolation, and retaliation to keep the victims quiet. There have been criminal charges against former employees, civil lawsuits from more than 1,000 former residents, and a state settlement fund created for survivors. So when I hear that Liz left that same institution on a furlough and never came back, I don't just hear teenage girl ran away. If Liz knew something about someone there and they believed she was going to talk to the authorities, a furlough would have been the perfect window to silence her. It gave her a reason to be outside, and it created a neat narrative before anything even happened. She was allowed to leave, she didn't return, and now the explanation writes itself. Troubled girl, almost 18, probably ran off. But then look at what happened next, and it becomes even more suspicious in my view. The facility apparently didn't raise the kind of alarm you would expect when a teenage girl in state custody vanished. The facility itself couldn't even say if she disappeared in April or November of 1984, which again is a massive waving red flag. Her case was later simply discharged when she would have turned 18, even though she had never returned, and that's the part that really bothers me. If someone from YDC, or someone connected to YDC, was involved, that failure to act would have been the most valuable quote-unquote gift imaginable. No missing person report meant no search of any kind, and no name in a database, which meant no trail to pursue when her body was found. And maybe involved here doesn't even have to mean the person who delivered the fatal blow in Tennessee. It could mean someone who helped her leave, or even more disturbingly, that someone handed her off. That's what makes this theory so disturbing. Liz wasn't just a teenager who disappeared from Manchester and ended up dead off exit 44. She was a ward of a system that was supposed to account for her, and later allegations against that system suggest a culture that let the worst people flourish. If that kind of culture existed around Liz in 1984, then maybe the mystery here isn't only how she got to Tennessee and ended up deceased. Maybe the mystery is who realized no one would come looking and who benefited from her being discharged from a system she had already vanished from. Anyway, unfortunately, it remains unclear to me if this case is still being seriously investigated, since I think this one is even darker than we could imagine. Sometime in the dark hours before sunrise on October 8th, 2014, someone entered a small house on a busy road just outside Albany, New York. By the time the morning shift was getting started at a takeout restaurant down the street, 4 people inside that house were gone. Inside were a father, a mother, and their 2 young boys. Whoever did this left behind blood and forensic evidence, but no name and no obvious reason for any of it. More than 10 years later, investigators still can't tell you who walked through that door or why. Jin Chen was 39 and his wife Haiyan Li was 38. Both had come from Hoyu, a town in Fujian, a coastal province in southeastern China. The Chens settled in Guilderland, a quiet suburb on the western edge of Albany, near a takeout place called King's Walk that was run by relatives and where Jin worked. 2 sons followed with Anthony, born in 2004, and Eddie in 2007. The boys grew up as ordinary American kids, walking to the local elementary school just like everyone else on the block. A neighbor later described the kind of normal you'd expect from any young family. The boys playing in the backyard while their mother gardened and kept an eye on them. By every visible measure, they'd built the exact life the move to America was supposed to deliver. A modest, steady suburban existence in a place where violent crime didn't exist. But underneath the surface, something was subtly off about the family, as financial records would later allegedly show. The alarm was raised by an empty spot on a shift schedule. Around midday on October 8th, a co-worker at King's Walk started to worry when Jin didn't turn up for work and didn't call to explain why. He walked the half mile or so to the Chen's home on Western Avenue, a busy four-lane stretch of US Route 20, and let himself in. What he found inside the small bungalow was beyond anything he could have braced for. His own English was so limited that he couldn't manage the emergency call himself. He had to track down another co-worker, a relative of the family, to dial 911 on his behalf and communicate the tragic scene he had seen. Guilderland police arrived and began sealing off the scene, soon joined by state police detectives who would spend the next several days combing the ground behind and around the house. Jin was found on the first floor while his wife and their two sons were upstairs, covered over with a blanket. The victims had been beaten, reportedly with a hammer, and stabbed. Autopsies eventually placed the time of death in a narrow window between roughly 3:30 and 6:30 that morning. The town's police chief, Carol Lawler, had grown up in that very neighborhood, and she admitted she'd never seen anything remotely like it. Within days, makeshift memorials of flowers and candles appeared both at the house and at the boys' school. The sheer scale of the thing pulled in a wave of press, including Chinese-language newspapers widely read among recent immigrants, who sent their own reporters from New York City. If the discovery was shocking, the investigation that followed was maddening. The first 48 hours after a crime are usually the most valuable, and in this case they slipped away almost entirely. Part of the problem was language, since many of the people detectives most needed to talk to were Fujianese immigrants who spoke a Min dialect. This dialect is only barely intelligible with the Mandarin most interpreters are trained in. To put this in a little more perspective, this isn't the difference between British English and American English. It's the difference between something like French and Spanish, where shared words would be noticed and a general meaning may be able to be grasped. But that's it. Simply finding someone who could communicate with potential witnesses to the degree required for a police investigation thus became a massive problem in itself. The bigger obstacle in the long run wasn't the language barrier, but fear. A deep, pervasive unease ran through the local Chinese immigrant community, and the Albany County District Attorney later described just how hard it was to get anyone to open up at all. The authorities did try to chip away at that silence, and the family put up a reward of $5,000. The district attorney went a step further, promising that, as far as it lay within his power, his office wouldn't move to deport anyone who came forward with what they knew. Neither the money nor the assurance loosened many tongues, despite the severity of the crime, though for reasons I'll discuss, the reason why may be quite simple. The people who could talk may have been threatened by something that to them was far more intimidating than the American government. Technology offered no shortcut either, since none of the homes or businesses near the Chens had security cameras that might have captured a vehicle or a face on the road that night. Investigators grew openly frustrated when Apple initially declined to release the family's iPhone records. Although the company eventually complied, the delay had set the case back at the exact moment momentum mattered most. Forensics did hand them something tangible, including genetic evidence that may well have belonged to the person responsible, but there was nothing to tie it to anyone. The exact nature of how and where this evidence was discovered hasn't been disclosed to the public, presumably to ensure the integrity of the investigation. Despite the best efforts of detectives, the case, which had rocked the region, went cold. A full year on, the case had generated only around 600 leads, a number the head of the state police's Criminal Investigations Bureau considered strangely low for a crime this severe. The reach of the effort, by contrast, was enormous despite the lack of any real progress. The FBI and the NYPD lent interpreters and manpower, and detectives reached out to police as far afield as Chicago, Los Angeles, Montreal, and even law enforcement back in China. The harder investigators looked at the Chen's life, the more the tidy picture of a hard-working restaurant family began to blur. From the start, there were investigators who felt the family's money simply didn't add up and suggested Jin Chen may have gotten involved with the wrong people. By some accounts, Jin had actually shut down his own restaurant a couple of years before he passed, and his wife was living in the country without legal status. Yet the household kept getting by comfortably, with no obvious source of steady income beyond whatever meager amount Jin pulled in. Jin was also known to host low-stakes card games at the house, and one early theory held that the family had been targeted by someone who came back after a late-night gambling session. Jin's brother disputed that specific version of events, while admitting the card games were real enough. The theory that drew the most serious attention reached well past a simple robbery. Jin had reportedly been moving large sums of unrecorded cash, the kind used to pay undocumented Chinese workers staffing restaurants across New York and far beyond it. The work allegedly involved ferrying laborers out of Manhattan's Chinatown to kitchens in distant towns and cities, mostly in upstate New York. That last detail found unsettling support inside the house itself, according to detectives. Investigators reportedly discovered something like 18 mattresses laid out across the basement floor. According to detectives, that was exactly the sort of setup you'd use to host a rotating crew of workers passing through. Set against that backdrop, Jin looked less like a simple line cook and more like a small but real cog in a much larger machine. If he truly was a node in that pipeline, then he sat close to a great deal of money that never touched any conventional bank. However, there's a potential problem with this theory, and that comes from the neighbors. Despite the fact that this operation would have required moving numerous people, no one ever reported any large volume of unusual comings or goings at the house. There were no complaints of the home being used as a makeshift flophouse prior to the attacks, and no one came forward with any such eyewitness testimony after. Once the organized crime angle was on the table, investigators started asking whether the slayings fit some wider pattern. Back in 2011, in D'Iberville, Mississippi, 3 members of a Chinese-American family who ran a restaurant, a married couple along with the wife's sister, were found stabbed inside their home. Investigators on that case eventually came to believe the 3 had been targeted by professionals dispatched all the way from New York City. There would be other echoes too, and at the very end of 2017, another family of 4 was found slain in the suburbs of Albany. This case immediately invited comparisons to the Chen case, though most of those were eventually set aside as a tragic coincidence. By 2018, the state police commander responsible for the region was once again publicly asking for help, reminding people that any scrap of information could crack the case. When he was pressed on whether organized crime was behind the Chen slayings, he wouldn't commit to it outright, but he didn't dismiss it either. The Chens were laid to rest about a month after they passed, in a funeral held in Manhattan's Chinatown. The delay was deliberate, timed so relatives traveling from China could secure the visas and the flights they needed to be there. The family was buried together at a cemetery in Queens, far from the quiet suburb where their lives had ended. In October 2024, a full 10 years on, Guilderland and state police marked the date once more and repeated the same message they'd been carrying the whole time. They're still investigating, but they still need someone, somewhere, to come forward. To me, the Chen family slayings don't feel like a burglary gone wrong. They feel like a professional job. Part of it is the way the perpetrator, or perpetrators, came and went, leaving behind little in the way of evidence. But really, it's every allegation surrounding Jin Chen. The reports about gambling, restaurant workers, undocumented labor, the movement of funds, and mattresses in the basement make the case feel bigger than one family in one house. Maybe those details don't prove organized crime, but they do suggest Jin may have been closer to a hidden economy than people first realized. And that's why the professional hit theory sticks out. This feels more like someone came to the house with a single purpose in mind. I also have to question whether the DNA evidence found at the scene was actually from one of the perpetrators or not. If the residence was being used for gambling and as some kind of trafficking flophouse, that genetic evidence could have potentially been from almost anyone. That said, we don't actually know where the evidence was found, and it's entirely possible that from the context of the investigation, it would have had to be from one of the attackers. Anyway, unfortunately, given this apparent organized crime connection, I have serious doubts about whether this case will ever see any form of resolution. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership if you want to take your support for my work to the next level. In the early hours of a July morning in 1994, a witness in a Medellin parking lot heard something strange in the spaces between the gunshots. The man holding the pistol wasn't cursing or shouting threats. With each pull of the trigger, he called out one word, the same word a television announcer screams when the ball hits the back of the net: goal. He said it 6 times, and by the time he stopped, the most admired defender in Colombian soccer was bleeding beside his own car. A country that had spent a year dreaming of World Cup glory was about to learn that something had gone irreversibly wrong. Andres Escobar was born in Medellin on the 13th of March 1967 into a middle-class family that had nothing to do with the coke money soaking through the city around them. He was, as that would imply, of no relation whatsoever to the more famous Escobar who ruled that city with an iron fist. His father was a banker who later set up a foundation to keep kids off the streets and on soccer pitches. He was a devout Catholic who, for years, went to morning mass with his mother whenever he got the chance. Andres was also known for his charitable work and being extremely giving of his time, despite being a massive superstar in his country. He carried himself the same way on the field, as a gentleman, and people noticed and loved him for it. By his 20s, he'd become the calm heart of Atlético Nacional's defense, a tall center back who preferred to read the game rather than kick his way out of trouble. In 1989, he helped his team become the first Colombian club to win the Copa Libertadores, South America's biggest club football prize, the equivalent of the Champions League. He'd also worn his country's colors at the 1990 World Cup in Italy, where Colombia reached the second round before going out to Cameroon. By 1994, there was reportedly a contract waiting from AC Milan, one of the grandest clubs on earth. He was engaged to a dentist named Pamela Cascardo, his partner of 5 years, and the two were meant to marry later that year. At 27, Andres Escobar's life looked like it was opening up rather than closing down. Colombia at the 1994 World Cup wasn't a hopeful underdog squad. This was, on paper, the best team the country had ever produced. The qualifying campaign had ended with a result that still sounds made up. In September 1993, in Buenos Aires, Colombia didn't just beat Argentina, they took them apart 5-0 on Argentine soil. Pelé, never shy with a prediction, tipped Colombia as one of his favorites to lift the trophy. For a nation more often discussed in connection with Pablo Escobar than anything good, the team had become a source of pride. But the same forces that made Colombian soccer rich in the early 90s also made it dangerous. Cartel money had flooded into the domestic clubs, turning matches into money laundering operations and betting opportunities for some very unforgiving men. The goalkeeper from the 1990 World Cup missed the 1994 tournament entirely because he'd spent months behind bars over his role as a go-between in a kidnapping ransom. That was the world this golden generation lived in. The soccer was beautiful, but what surrounded it was anything but. The darkness reached the squad before the tournament even turned sour. Coach Francisco Maturana later described the strain his players were under, and he admitted he simply couldn't bring himself to put another man's life at risk. The most chilling example came down to a single team composition decision. Maturana was warned that if he started the midfielder, Gabriel Gomez, that player and the coach would pay for it with their lives. The threat named a specific man and a specific consequence, and reportedly it came by phone and by fax. Gomez was pulled from the side that faced the United States and replaced by Hernan Gaviria, a young midfielder thrown into the most poisonous atmosphere imaginable. The coach was effectively picking his lineup with a revolver to the team's head, and Colombia, weighed down by expectation and a dose of fear, fell apart on the pitch. They lost their opening match to Romania 3-1, a result nobody had seen coming. Suddenly, the Golden Team was staring at elimination before the tournament had really begun, and the second group game, against the host nation, became must-win. On the 22nd of June 1994, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the United States and Colombia met in front of a vast crowd. In the 34th minute, the American midfielder John Harkes drove toward the byline and swung a low ball across the face of Colombia's goal. Escobar, doing exactly what a defender is trained to do, stretched out a leg to cut the cross out before it could reach an attacker. He got too much on it, and the ball skidded off his boot, past his own diving goalkeeper, and into the net. It was the kind of accident that routinely happens in soccer, but this time it put the United States ahead, and the Americans went on to win 2-1. The math was now brutal for Colombia's chances to advance, and Romania would need to lose to the United States in a big way, and Colombia would need to destroy Switzerland. Colombia would manage to beat Switzerland in their final game, but it didn't matter because of the result of the other game in the group. Romania's win over the United States sent the Colombians home at the bottom of their group. One of the great pre-tournament favorites dumped out in the first round. Escobar, the great gentleman of Colombian soccer, beloved by the people, had put the ball into his own net in the game that broke the dream. He had no way of knowing for certain how some very dangerous people back home would take that, and what he did next suggested that he didn't fully appreciate the danger. When the tournament ended, Escobar had options, and in retrospect, he likely ought to have taken them. He could have stayed in the United States for a time and visited relatives in Las Vegas, allowing time to let the dust settle. Friends back in Colombia reportedly wanted him to do exactly that, urging him that the situation at home wasn't safe. Instead, he chose to fly home to Medellin, because that was who he was. He wasn't going to hide from his own people over an honest mistake, and he'd even written a newspaper column urging Colombians to keep their heads up. He told them in his gentle way that life carried on, that errors happen, and that they'd see each other again soon on the national stage. He even went so far as to openly accept responsibility for Colombia crashing out of the World Cup, which, all things considered, clearly wasn't accurate. The entire team was playing under conditions that no athlete can properly perform under, with even the team composition itself being dictated by criminals. Escobar's response only deepened the sense amongst the majority of Colombians that he was a decent and humble person. The criminal pressure the team was facing was widely known in Colombia, and he could have sought to blame the circumstances or his teammates or management, but he didn't. He ended his column, in a statement of bitter retrospective irony, with a line saying, quote, "Life doesn't end here." Under normal circumstances, this response would have been seen as admirable, and for the vast majority of people, it was. Unfortunately for Escobar, he was returning to one of the most dangerous cities in what was then one of the most dangerous countries in the world. On the night of the 1st of July, less than a week after the elimination, Escobar called some friends and went out in an upscale district in the city. I have to note here that it really seems like he believed that his sincere apology was enough to quell the unrest around him. They stopped at a liquor store and then ended up at a nightclub called El Indio, and at some point the group split up. By around 3 in the morning on the 2nd of July, Andres Escobar was alone in the parking lot, sitting in his car, when 3 men walked up to him. An argument started, and according to accounts from that night, the men had been needling him about the own goal, and Escobar, normally so composed, argued back. What happened next took only seconds, and at least 2 of the men drew their weapons. One of them opened fire and shot Escobar 6 times. Witnesses reported the detail that would horrify the world. The shooter shouted the word "goal" after each shot, mocking him. He was echoing the commentary from the broadcast as if every shot were being celebrated in a stadium. The men then climbed into a Toyota pickup truck and drove off, leaving Escobar where he lay. He was rushed to a hospital, but the wounds were too much, and roughly 45 minutes later, Andres Escobar was gone. He was 27 years old, 10 days removed from the touch that had ended Colombia's World Cup, and a few months short of the wedding he'd been planning with his fiancée. One of the greatest soccer players Colombia had ever produced had been cut down in his own city. And the manner of it, that taunting word repeated over a dying man, turned a personal tragedy into something the whole world would remember. By morning, the country understood it had lost far more than a great defender, but also a source of national pride. A suspect was in custody almost immediately. On the night of the shooting, police arrested a man named Humberto Castro Munoz, and the next day he confessed to firing the shots. Castro was no random drunk who'd lost his temper. He worked as a bodyguard and driver tied to 2 sinister brothers. Pedro David and Juan Santiago Galón Henao were well-known figures in Medellin's underworld who'd been in the parking lot that night. By several accounts, Juan Galón had bet heavily on Colombia at the World Cup and lost a fortune when the team crashed out. That connection is the engine behind the version of events most people know. Escobar wasn't simply the victim of a barroom argument gone wrong, but a man cut down because powerful gamblers had lost money and wanted someone to blame. Whether the own goal was the true motive or just the insult thrown during a fatal confrontation has never been fully untangled, but the shooter's taunting made the link impossible to ignore. Castro Munoz was found guilty in June 1995 and handed a 43-year sentence, but it didn't hold. The term was later cut to 26 years, and through reductions for good behavior, he walked free in 2005 after serving around 11 years. The other men who were directly involved in the confrontation were never found guilty of any criminal wrongdoing in the slaying. That fact, along with the fact that the actual shooter effectively served just over a decade for what he did, has raised eyebrows. Many, including Escobar's widow, have suggested that this result indicates that there was some sort of judicial corruption at play. Notably, this is a country where just 10 years before, Pablo Escobar had allegedly paid a guerrilla group to lay siege to the Supreme Court of Colombia. To say this was a country where the rule of law had been absolutely bent to the will of powerful cartel interests would be something of an understatement. The 2 brothers, whom prosecutors alleged were the actual shot callers, never ended up facing trial, and their role in the crime, if any, remains a matter of speculation until this day. Juan Galón, for his part, was cut down in a restaurant in Mexico on February 4th, 2026. The exact circumstances of the attack are still under investigation, and the attack appears to have been particularly brutal, since he couldn't be identified by appearance alone. Not everyone accepts the gambling story, despite the way this case has been framed over the decades. To break the fourth wall for a moment, I had done research on this to include in a video about solved cases. But ultimately, on reflection, I consider the core of this case to be fundamentally unsolved, even if the gambling angle is the most likely explanation. Years later, Maturana, the coach who'd watched his players live under threat, insisted that Escobar's death had nothing to do with soccer at all. He claimed that his player had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time in a city where violence was a daily fact of life. While I find this very difficult to believe, it's a reminder that Medellin in 1994 didn't need any specific reason to produce a body. To put this in perspective, NYC was at the height of its violence at the time, and despite that, Medellin's violent crime rate was about 14 times higher than the Big Apple. In the summer of 2012, one of the most experienced spine surgeons in Dallas stood in an operating room, looking at the inside of a woman who'd been operated on days earlier. What he found made so little sense that only one explanation seemed to fit. The man who'd done this couldn't actually be a surgeon. Somewhere out there, he figured, was a real Dr. Christopher Dunch, and somebody had stolen his name, his diplomas, and his license. So he tracked down a photograph of the man and sent it to the training program in Memphis that had supposedly produced him, along with a simple question, asking if it was him. The surgeon thought he had discovered a serious criminal act committed by a phony surgeon. When the answer from Memphis came back that yes, that was Dr. Dunch, that sent a shock through the surgeon, since the answer was far more frightening than an imposter could have been. It suggested immediately that this wasn't simply a case of someone who didn't know what he was doing. It was someone who had weaponized his medical knowledge. Christopher Dunch grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the eldest of 4 children of a physical therapist and a school teacher in a family that prized achievement. The defining story people tell about his youth involves football and his dreams of hitting it big in the NFL. He played linebacker in high school and decided he was going to play at the next level, despite the inconvenient fact that he wasn't very good. He started at tiny Millsaps College in Mississippi, then left to chase something bigger and clawed his way onto the roster at Colorado State as a Division I walk-on. Teammates remembered a guy who'd outwork anyone in the weight room and beg coaches to rerun drills he kept botching without ever getting much better. He eventually transferred home to Memphis, where the moves had wrecked his eligibility and the dream of going any further came to an end. In retrospect, the dream wasn't realistic for him given his abilities and build, but the determination was admirable. The young Dunch decided to pour that same blunt force ambition into something new. He decided that he was going to be a doctor, and not just any doctor. He wanted to be a neurosurgeon. On paper, he pulled it off spectacularly, and he spent roughly 15 years at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis. He stacked up an MD and a PhD and won grant money for stem cell research on spinal discs. He ran a lab and he co-founded a biotech company called DiscGenics that drew in millions of dollars from venture capitalists, as well as his own mentors. The company is quite successful until this day, and even maintains a disclaimer and an acknowledgement of Dr. Dunch. Honestly, I find it quite admirable that they didn't just simply write him out of the entire picture, given the evil acts he would commit. Personally, I think this is one of the things that makes the story of Dr. Dunch deeply tragic, since this was a person who had the skill and ability to improve the lives of millions worldwide. Instead, he chose to focus on the worst kinds of evil imaginable, which in a certain light perhaps makes him one of the worst people to ever live. But I digress. Anyone reading Dr. Dunch's resume saw a rising star, the rare surgeon-scientist who could really do it all, and actually had done it all already. But unfortunately for Dunch, the operating room told a different story, and this part makes me question how he was able to qualify as a fully licensed neurosurgeon. During a neurosurgery residency, a trainee typically takes part in something like 1,000 procedures. According to records that surfaced years later, Dunch, for reasons that aren't quite clear, performed fewer than 100. There were also darker problems to suggest that his life was already spiraling out of control at this point. Partway through his training, he was reportedly sent to a program for physicians suffering from addiction after allegations that he'd been huffing Colombian confetti the night before surgery. He completed the program, and despite all his shortcomings, he finished his residency. He topped it off with a minimally invasive spine fellowship at a respected Memphis practice. In 2011, Dunch moved to Texas, and he started working at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano, an upscale hospital north of Dallas. They brought him in to anchor its minimally invasive spine program, reportedly guaranteeing him about $600,000 a year, plus a cut of the revenue he generated. Elective spine surgery is one of the most profitable product lines in American medicine, and Dunch looked like a machine built to generate it. His credentials checked out and his references were stellar, but despite that, the trouble started almost immediately. In late 2011, he operated on a man named Lee Passmore, who worked, in a grim bit of irony, for the county medical examiner's office. A veteran vascular surgeon was assisting that day, and what he watched unfold alarmed him so much that he reportedly swore he'd never share an operating room with Dunch again. Hardware ended up in the wrong place, and while Passmore survived, he left that table with chronic pain that never went away. That veteran surgeon, Dr. Randall Kirby, would start making his moves to bring down Dr. Dunch, but for the time being, there simply wasn't enough evidence to do much. A few weeks later, in January 2012, Dunch fused the spine of a man named Barry Morgoloff. The operation left bone fragments near his spinal canal, and Morgoloff walked out worse than he went in, eventually losing much of the function in one leg. Spinal surgery is inherently extremely risky, even in the hands of the most experienced and conscientious surgeons, so no additional red flags went up, not yet at least. What happened next is the part of the narrative nobody can quite explain even today. In February 2012, Dunch performed an elective neck surgery on Jerry Summers, his closest friend since their school days in Memphis. Summers had followed him to Dallas and worked for him, and he trusted Dunch enough to let him operate on his neck to fix lingering pain from an old injury. The procedure went catastrophically wrong, and Dunch damaged the area so badly, with so much blood loss, that Summers woke up unable to move his arms or legs. He never walked again, and spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair before passing away in 2021. A few days later, lying in intensive care, Summers began shouting at the nursing staff that he and Dunch had been doing coke together the night before the operation. He later took it back, but a statement like that can't be unsaid, and Dunch was reported. The hospital ordered a drug test, which Dunch managed to delay for days before passing, then cleared him to return, restricted to minor procedures. Then, in March 2012, he got a routine lumbar case, the kind of operation experienced spine surgeons consider about as low risk as the specialty gets. The patient was Kelly Martin, a 55-year-old schoolteacher and mother who'd hurt her back in a fall. During the procedure, Dunch cut through a major blood vessel, and she bled internally while the rest of the team scrambled. Sadly, she passed away that same day, and an autopsy classified her death as a quote-unquote therapeutic misadventure, which sounds about as euphemistic as possible. Baylor, Plano, and Dunch parted ways in April 2012, and this perhaps should have been the end of the line for this disturbed surgeon. But here's the thing, he wasn't fired, since after some legal wrangling, he was allowed to resign. He walked out with a lawyer-negotiated letter stating that all areas of concern about him had been closed. The National Practitioner Data Bank, the federal clearinghouse that exists to warn hospitals about dangerous doctors, received nothing that would have stopped him. In July 2012, Dallas Medical Center granted Dunch temporary privileges while his application was still being processed. He lasted about a week, long enough for 3 operations, and at this point the pattern started to get even darker. Among his first patients, there was Floella Brown, a woman in her early 60s who'd come in for a neck fusion. During the operation, he pierced her vertebral artery, one of the main vessels feeding the brain. By the next morning, she'd suffered a massive stroke, and while Brown lay dying in the ICU, Dunch went ahead with his next scheduled case. This one was on a 74-year-old woman named Mary Efford. Efford woke up in agony, unable to stand. The hospital called in Dr. Robert Henderson, the veteran spine surgeon I mentioned in the beginning, to figure out what had happened. Dr. Henderson was, in essence, everything Dunch should have been on paper, except, actually a highly competent surgeon who cared about his patients. Dr. Henderson is, in essence, the hero of the story, the man who staked his entire reputation and livelihood on getting justice for these patients. But more on that shortly. When Henderson reopened her back, he found a spinal fusion attempted in the wrong place, screws drilled into muscle instead of bone, and a nerve root severed outright. Henderson had spent decades doing this work and repaired plenty of other surgeons' mistakes, and to him this didn't look like a series of mistakes. It looked like someone who didn't know what a spine was supposed to look like, which is what led him to the imposter theory and the photograph he sent to Memphis. In the meantime, Floella Brown's family took her off life support, and the Dallas Medical Center let Dunch go. Once again, the report that might have ended his career didn't reach the data bank in time to matter. From that point on, 2 surgeons set out on a mission to end the career of Dr. Dunch once and for all. These were Dr. Henderson, of course, and that vascular specialist, Dr. Randall Kirby, who'd seen Dunch's sloppy work up close and come away appalled. Dr. Kirby had been looking for someone in Dr. Dunch's own specialty who could verify his suspicions, and Dr. Henderson was just the man to do that. Henderson reported him to the Texas Medical Board in the summer of 2012, backed by detailed documentation, then watched, increasingly enraged, as very little happened. The board took months to investigate, and meanwhile, Dunch kept finding work, drifting down the food chain of Dallas area medicine. He could no longer find work in prestige hospitals, so he went to outpatient surgery centers and struggling hospitals hungry for the revenue a spine surgeon brings. At a facility in Frisco, he operated on a woman named Jacqueline Troy and damaged her vocal cords and an artery, leaving her sedated for weeks and fed through a tube. Other patients from this period, men like Philip Mayfield and Marshall Muse, came off his table with lasting damage. Each institution discovered what he was, and each showed him the door. If you're wondering why nobody just sued him into oblivion, Texas law had an answer. A 2003 tort reform package capped non-economic damages in malpractice cases at $250,000. Suing a hospital for credentialing a dangerous doctor required proving the hospital acted with something close to malice. And while I personally wish I could say that a brave plaintiff personal injury lawyer solved this case, attorneys turned Dunch's victims away because the math didn't work. As someone who spent over a decade doing personal injury work, I have to question whether Dr. Dunch knowingly targeted people based on this tort reform law. In fact, I have to question whether his entire reason for choosing Texas as a place to work was based upon this law. Medical malpractice cases are extremely difficult, and disbursements, in the form of expert reports, can easily run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dr. Dunch surely knew this, and likely realized that if he targeted people who in essence would have had a claim for pain and suffering only, no one would ever sue him. After all, it wouldn't make much sense to sue someone if you were going to end up in the hole after a settlement or a trial victory. Anyway, that's just my educated speculation on the matter based on my experience from my profession. In June 2013, at a small hospital on the south side of Dallas, Dunch performed what turned out to be his final surgery on a patient named Jeff Glidewell. He mistook part of Glidewell's neck anatomy for a tumor and started cutting it out, damaging his esophagus and vocal cords and slicing an artery. He then packed the wound with a sponge and closed him up, just leaving it there. Operating room staff reportedly tried to warn him mid-procedure, but he just kept on doing what he was doing. The sponge stayed inside, and Glidewell developed sepsis. Dr. Kirby helped with the rescue, then filed a sworn complaint with the medical board that read like a public safety bulletin. He called Dunch a sociopath and warned that more patients would be maimed or worse unless the board acted immediately. This time it worked, and on June 26, 2013, the Texas Medical Board suspended Dunch's license, and by December it was revoked. In about 18 months, he'd operated on 38 patients in the Dallas area, and prosecutors would later conclude that all but a handful were maimed or worse. One document in this case pulls everything into a darker focus, and it was written before most of the harm happened. In December 2011, around the time of his earliest Dallas surgeries, Dunch sat down at about 4 in the morning and sent a rambling email. It was pages of bizarre grievance and self-mythology, sent to his surgical assistant and sometime girlfriend. Buried inside it was a passage prosecutors would later read aloud to a jury. He wrote that the people closest to him saw him as something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. Then he announced that he was ready to leave behind the love, kindness, and patience mixed into who he was, and to become a cold-blooded killer. His lawyer pointed out that the same email rambled about vodka and stimulants, and they'd call the whole thing drunken venting. The state of Texas would call it evidence that he wasn't just a big old goofball who didn't know an esophagus from a tumor. He was a serial killer in scrubs. With the civil courts effectively closed due to the tort reform law, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office tried something that had never really been done. A team of prosecutors spent months combing through medical records and building a criminal case against a licensed surgeon for what he did inside an operating room. The legal theory was untested, but in July 2015, Dunch was taken into custody. By then he was broke, bankrupt, and fresh off an arrest for walking out of a Walmart with nearly $900 worth of merchandise. The indictment included multiple counts of aggravated assault and one count of injury to an elderly individual, the charge tied to Mary Efford. The trial opened in Dallas in February 2017, and the prosecution did something unusual. Rather than argue a single botched surgery, they put more than a dozen of his former patients in front of the jury to establish a pattern. They argued that Dunch knew the harm he was causing and kept operating anyway. The defense countered that he was a poorly trained surgeon, failed by the institutions around him, incompetent, but not criminal. The jury heard about the email, the warnings, the friend in the wheelchair, and the women who never went home. They convicted him of injuring Mary Efford, and in February 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison. This was a result widely described as the first of its kind for an American surgeon's conduct in the operating room. An appeals court upheld the conviction in 2018, and he'll be eligible for parole in 2045 when he's 74 years old. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about the case of Dr. Dunch is that the true extent of the harm he caused remains a mystery. He had access to patients in some capacity or another for a period of almost 20 years, and I have to question how many he actually harmed over that time. The disturbing emails seem to suggest that he was a complete sociopath with virtually unfettered access to people who trusted him to be on their side. Most of us never truly second guess what our physicians say, especially specialist physicians like neurosurgeons. While Dr. Dunch only officially ended the lives of 2 people and left countless others permanently damaged, I have to think that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is speculation on my part, but I think there's a good chance that he may have built up to his botched surgeries over the years. For instance, he was in a unique position to make a small, nearly undetectable mistake that most people would never notice. He was also in the position to simply ignore problems that patients had, and who knows how many people perished due to his inaction. The only reason he was ever caught was because he completely spiraled out of control due to his problems with various substances. Had he simply followed through on what he had said in the email and done so without his life falling apart around him, we may have been looking at a much higher victim count. That's the scariest thought, since if he had simply been able to hold it together, he likely would have got away with it for much longer. In fact, he may never have been caught at all, and if he was, he may have been able to frame it all as negligence, as his attorneys argued at trial. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. Anyway, the story of Dr. Dunch was, disturbingly, the most minor case I'm going to cover in this video, so buckle up, it's about to get a lot darker. On the afternoon of June 27th, 1997, federal agents arrested a fit, sandy-haired American doctor at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, midway between Africa and a new hospital job in Saudi Arabia. The warrant mentioned nothing more dramatic than fraud, a big deal for anyone, especially a physician. But the men in suits believed they were standing in front of one of the most prolific poisoners in American history. He was a physician who, by some estimates, had ended the lives of as many as 60 people across 2 continents. He had spent 14 years slipping through every net that medicine and the law had built to catch him, but this time, he was trapped. His name was Michael Swango, and this is the story of what he was and how he kept getting away with it. Swango was born on October 21st, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, the middle of 3 sons in a career military family. His father, John Virgil Swango, was an Army officer who served in Vietnam and was, by most accounts, a cold and largely absent presence. The family eventually settled in Quincy, Illinois, a river town on the Mississippi, where Michael's mother Muriel raised the boys mostly on her own. On paper, Michael was the son every parent in Quincy wanted, and he graduated valedictorian of his high school class in 1972. He played clarinet well enough to earn a music scholarship to Millikan University. Then he abruptly quit school, joined the Marine Corps, and served until an honorable discharge in 1976. He came home, enrolled at Quincy College, and graduated summa cum laude in chemistry and biology, picking up an award from the American Chemical Society along the way. In 1979, he was accepted into Southern Illinois University's School of Medicine, and that's where the first signs of trouble emerged. Classmates noticed he did the bare minimum, skipping lectures while moonlighting long hours as an ambulance attendant, a job he seemed to love far more than medicine itself. More unsettling were the scrapbooks. Swango collected newspaper clippings of plane crashes and violent disasters. He discussed them with an enthusiasm that made people uncomfortable, as if he wasn't just interested in the events, but almost relishing them. This, of course, is one of those things that could have been entirely innocent in retrospect, but given who Swango turned out to be, it looked more like a dark omen. When his estranged father passed away during his medical school years, the family reportedly discovered that the old soldier had kept a collection of grim newspaper clippings of his own. Michael apparently treated the discovery as a point of kinship to a man he otherwise had almost no relationship with. His clinical work, meanwhile, was so unreliable that fellow students took to rechecking his patient workups. In a grim irony, his classmates took to calling him 00 Swango, a James Bond reference. The joke was that he was so negligent that handing him a medical license would be the equivalent of a license to kill. That said, everyone seems to agree that this nickname didn't indicate that he would do this willfully, but that he was just such a lazy dunce that he'd leave his patients in the morgue. I'm not sure if that makes it better or not, but the nickname stuck, at least among his fellow medical students. In his final year, he was very nearly expelled when a supervisor concluded he'd fabricated parts of his patient histories, which seems like it should have been the end of the line for him. The school's leadership moved to expel him, and under rules that required a unanimous vote, a single committee member's holdout reportedly kept him in. He was permitted to graduate in 1983, behind his original class, after repeating the work that he had fraudulently made up. That one vote would prove to be among the most consequential second chances in the history of American medicine. In an alternative universe, it ended there, proving that perhaps some people don't really deserve second chances at all, especially when it comes to issues of dishonesty and positions of trust. And it wasn't just that he was fabricating lab data for a research project or something, which is bad enough in and of itself. He was fabricating the real medical histories of actual patients, indicating that it was well known that he was already the sort of guy who was willing to endanger lives. My own speculation is that getting away with this would embolden him, because as you'll see, he was incredibly bold over the coming decades, and I don't mean this as praise. Despite everything, Swango landed a surgical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center beginning in 1983, with a path toward the neurosurgery program. Within months, nurses on his wards noticed something they couldn't explain. Patients who'd been stable were suddenly going into respiratory arrest, and an uncomfortable number of those emergencies happened when the new intern was on the floor. The nurses talked among themselves and grew more convinced with each incident, but they sat near the bottom of a hospital hierarchy that wasn't built to take their suspicions seriously. One of those patients was Cynthia Ann McGee, a 19-year-old college gymnast recovering after being struck by a car while cycling. In January 1984, she passed away in her hospital bed, and nobody suspected a thing at the time. The young motorist who'd hit her carried the legal blame for her death, and 16 years would pass before Swango admitted he'd injected potassium into her intravenous line. Then came the case that nearly stopped him in his tracks, one of the many potential off-ramps in Swango's medical career. In February 1984, Rena Cooper, a 69-year-old woman, was recovering from routine back surgery. She went into violent convulsions and stopped breathing moments after a blonde doctor was seen at her bedside fiddling with her IV. A resuscitation team saved her, and because she'd been intubated and couldn't yet speak, she was given a pad and pencil. What she conveyed was unambiguous. An unknown male physician had put something into her line, and he looked like he wasn't supposed to be there, despite him clearly being a doctor. Her roommate described the same blonde physician slipping in and out of the room, and a syringe was found discarded nearby. The nurses pushed the alarm up the chain and waited for the hospital to act like a crime had happened on its own 9th floor. But then things got even weirder. What happened next has been picked over for decades. Ohio State conducted an internal inquiry that was, by nearly every later assessment, cursory. Senior physicians interviewed a handful of people, accepted Swango's denials, never called the police, and concluded there was nothing to act on. Nobody pulled his file from Southern Illinois, and nobody ran the simple comparison of his shifts against the ward's emergencies that investigators would run years later. The hospital let him finish his internship, but declined to keep him on or to give him a reference for any future work, which was, of course, seen as a massive red flag by other employers. The dark nickname his medical school classmates had hung on him, Double O Swango, was starting to look less like a joke and much more like a prophecy. A review later commissioned by the university concluded the original investigation had been badly inadequate, but by then the moment had long passed, and evidence had gone stale. In July 1984, Swango went home to Quincy and took a job as an emergency medical technician with the Adams County Ambulance Service. It says something about his confidence that a man who just walked away from a poisoning inquiry went straight back to handling other people's food and drink. It also says something that a newly licensed physician wasn't working as a doctor, since, physician jobs aren't exactly ever not in demand. Almost immediately, his colleagues at the ambulance service noticed a pattern that sounds absurd, or would sound absurd if it wasn't related to this monster. Whenever Swango made the coffee or turned up with donuts or pop, people got violently sick, with nausea and dizziness that no shared meal could explain. That September, several paramedics were left retching for days following a box of tainted donuts he'd brought in. His co-workers decided to do something the doctors at Ohio State never did, and they ran their own successful sting. They left him alone with a pitcher of iced tea, then had the tea tested, and the laboratory found arsenic in it. When police searched his belongings in October 1984, they turned up arsenic-based ant poison, syringes, assorted chemicals, and handwritten notes about poisons. Swango insisted the whole thing was a misunderstanding, claiming an innocent fascination with chemistry. He waived his right to a jury, and after a 2-week bench trial in the spring of 1985, Judge Dennis Cashman convicted him of aggravated battery for poisoning his co-workers. That August, Cashman handed him 5 years, remarking in substance that it was obvious this man couldn't be trusted around anyone, anywhere. Illinois detectives alerted Columbus, and the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office took a fresh look at the Ohio State deaths. Unfortunately, though, with the trail cold and the hospital's records thin, no charges ever came. Swango served roughly 2 years and walked out of prison in August 1987, a convicted poisoner with a medical degree and every intention of using it. Illinois and Ohio revoked his medical licenses, but a revoked license only matters if the next employer isn't fooled by fabricated documents. For the time being, though, it appeared that Dr. Swango's reign of terror was over. He resurfaced in Newport News, Virginia, where he found work first as a career counselor and later as a laboratory technician. At the lab, co-workers reportedly began suffering bouts of unexplained illness, though nothing was ever proven. It was in this period that he met Kristen Kinney, a bright, well-liked nurse, and the two got engaged. To get back into medicine, Swango essentially rebuilt himself out of forged papers, something that wouldn't be possible today. He produced a forged fact sheet recasting his felony as a conviction over a fistfight, along with a fabricated document suggesting his record had been cleared. He mailed applications to residency programs across the country, seeking to re-establish himself as a physician. The system he was gaming had no central registry that would have flagged him, and most programs simply took an applicant's paperwork at face value. In 1992, the internal medicine program at the University of South Dakota in Sioux Falls took him. The dean heard Swango's story about a youthful barroom brawl directly from the man himself, found his supposed honesty disarming, and decided he deserved a second chance. For several months it actually worked, and supervisors found him capable and hardworking. Kinney moved out to Sioux Falls to be with him, taking a nursing job of her own, but soon she began suffering crushing migraines, unlike anything she'd known before. Then Swango pushed his luck by applying for membership in the American Medical Association, whose background check was more thorough than anyone else. It was there the Illinois poisoning conviction was discovered. Around the same time, a television program aired a segment on his case, and colleagues recognized him. Before 1992 was out, so was he, and Kinney went home to Virginia, and her migraines faded away once she was out of the apartment she'd shared with him. In July 1993, she was found deceased, and investigators ruled that she'd pulled the curtains on herself. Years later, examiners reportedly found elevated levels of arsenic in samples of her hair, and her mother has spent the years since asking what was happening to her daughter in Sioux Falls. Nobody has ever been charged in connection with her passing, and the official ruling stands, but it's suspected Swango may have been involved. Here's the part that's hard to believe because while the South Dakota scandal was still warm, Swango applied to a psychiatric residency. This time it was at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and he told the same barroom brawl story and was believed again. In June 1993, he started his first rotation, practicing internal medicine at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport on Long Island, with full access to patients and medications. The men on that ward had survived the worst and had given everything for their country, but they didn't survive their doctor. Over the following months, 3 veterans in his care, George Ciano, Thomas Samarco, and Aldo Serini, passed away under his care. Federal prosecutors later established that this was due to injections of toxic substances. A 4th patient, Baron Harris, was injected and slipped into a coma from which he never recovered. Families were told their fathers and husbands had simply declined, the kind of thing that happens on a ward full of elderly veterans, and the deaths drew no particular attention at the time. Some relatives would later recall details that hadn't sat right, but in 1993 there was no reason for anyone to imagine the resident was the danger. In October 1993, the dean out in South Dakota learned where Swango had landed and picked up the phone. Stony Brook dismissed him within days, and the fallout cost both the program head who'd vouched for him and the medical school's dean their positions. This time, the warning finally went wide. Before stepping down, Stony Brook's dean sent an alert about Swango to every medical school in the country and roughly 1,000 teaching hospitals. American medicine was, at last, closed to him, and a federal investigation into how he'd lied his way into a government hospital began grinding forward. That investigation would eventually take him down, but not before he could claim more victims. Swango spent 1994 working as a chemist at a wastewater facility in Atlanta until the FBI tracked him down and his employer learned exactly who it had hired. So in November 1994, he boarded a plane for Zimbabwe, and I'll let you take one guess what he was doing there. He arrived in Africa with forged credentials and a clean story, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church hired him to practice at Many Mission Hospital. This was a remote facility in Zimbabwe's Meberengwa district, hours of rough road from the nearest city of any size. To an understaffed rural hospital, an American-trained doctor willing to work in the middle of nowhere for almost no money looked like a gift from heaven. The warning system that had finally locked him out of American medicine didn't reach across the Atlantic. The staff gave him responsibility, and the patients gave him their full trust. But within months, the same shadow fell. Stable patients began deteriorating overnight, and post-operative cases who should have gone home were found comatose or gone by morning. This time, though, there were survivors willing to speak plainly. A patient named Kaneas Mezazewa woke to find Swango injecting something into his arm and managed a single scream before paralysis took hold. Staff revived him, and he lived to accuse the doctor directly, saying that Swango had been the one who had done it. Another man, recovering from a routine leg operation, cried out to staff that the doctor had injected him with a bizarre substance, and he was gone within hours. A young woman, hospitalized while in labor, survived an injection only because her screams brought nurses running to her rescue. The mission doctors acted relatively quickly, and the supposedly clean American doctor was suspended in 1995, reported to police, and formally accused of poisoning patients. In the surrounding villages, his name became something close to a curse. The doctor who wasn't there to heal, but to harm. He hired a lawyer and protested his innocence, but as the case moved toward a hearing in 1996, he slipped across the border into Zambia and made his way on to Namibia. There, he took advantage of the lack of cross-border communication, and he found temporary medical work. He realized quickly, though, that Namibia could only be a stopover, that he needed to get out of southern Africa as soon as possible to avoid the law. He got to work doing what he did best, reinventing himself, and he began applying to hospitals as far away as possible. In March 1997, using a resume scrubbed of everything sinister, he applied for a position at a hospital in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and got it. Thankfully, though, this time he would never get access to any patients. The Saudi job came with one catch. He had to pass back through the United States to sort out his visa, and his route ran through Chicago. I have to imagine the sort of hubris that he had to believe he could return home to America without issue. He must have thought he was absolutely untouchable, despite the fact that he quite clearly wasn't. American investigators who'd spent 3 years building a federal fraud case over the lies he told to get inside the Northport VA knew he was coming. On June 27, 1997, they took him at O'Hare without incident in relation to the forged paperwork, and didn't give him any real indication what they were actually looking at him for. Swango pleaded guilty to fraud in 1998 and drew a sentence of 3.5 years, which handed prosecutors a deadline rather than a victory. The fraud conviction punished the lying, not the dying, and his release date was set for July 2000, with every reason to believe he'd vanish abroad the moment he walked free. So the FBI, federal prosecutors, and Veterans Affairs investigators raced the calendar. The remains of the Northport patients were exhumed, and tissue analysis revealed toxins that had no business being there. American investigators traveled to Zimbabwe as well, where exhumed remains from the Mene area reportedly showed traces of poison. And then there were his own words. Investigators also held notebooks in which Swango had written about his compulsions in terms prosecutors would later read into the court record. He described the rush these episodes gave him, and wrote in substance that they were the only reminder he had that he was truly alive. In July 2000, days before he was due to walk free, federal prosecutors charged him with the deaths of Ciano, Samarco, and Serini, and the poisoning of Baron Harris. He was also hit with an even larger stack of fraud counts, just to make sure that something stuck on the off chance that they couldn't convict on the big charges. He faced a possible trip to the chair, and Zimbabwe wanted him for trial as well for the sick acts he had pulled in that country. On September 6, 2000, in a federal courtroom in Uniondale, New York, Swango took a deal that spared his life. He admitted point by point that he'd poisoned the 3 Northport veterans, and that back in January 1984, he'd ended the life of Cynthia McGee. By way of reminder, that was the 19-year-old gymnast whose passing had been blamed on a teenage driver. Judge Jacob Mishler sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Relatives of the Northport veterans watched from the gallery as the man who'd been their father's doctor was finally named for what he was. Swango was sent to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, where he remains today. Investigators ultimately concluded that the 4 deaths he admitted to were a fraction of the real toll. They provided estimates running from 35 victims to as many as 60 across Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Zimbabwe. That's a figure that would place him among the most prolific serial predators America has ever produced. As part of the deal that spared his life, he never faced trial for what happened in Zimbabwe, and so the true number was never settled in any courtroom. The only man who knows it is sitting in a concrete cell in Colorado, and he's never volunteered it, and most likely, he never will. By the summer of 1998, a taxi driver in the English town of Hyde had quietly counted 21 names onto a private list, and the list kept growing. His regulars were mostly older women who lived alone, the kind of customers who booked him for shopping runs and hospital appointments and chatted the whole way there. One by one, they'd stopped calling. They were found in the afternoons, fully dressed, sitting upright in their armchairs as though they'd nodded off mid-conversation. John Shaw couldn't prove anything, and for a long time he didn't dare say what he was thinking out loud. He'd simply noticed something nobody else seemed willing to see. Every name on his list had the same family doctor. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in Nottingham on January 14, 1946, the middle child of a truck driver and a housewife in a working-class era. His mother, Vera, doted on him, and by most accounts she'd decided early on that Harold was the one of her 3 children destined for something better. Then, when he was 17, Harold's beloved mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, and there wasn't much the doctors could do to actually cure her. Through the spring of 1963, the teenage Shipman watched a family doctor call at the house and administer morphine to ease her pain. He watched the relief settle over her each time a dosage was administered. She passed on June 21, 1963, at the age of 43. And that night, the story goes, her son ran through the rain for hours. It's a detail that gets repeated in nearly every account of his life, and for good reason. The scene at his mother's bedside, a trusted physician, arriving at the home of a dying woman, would become the precise template of his crimes. Whether it explains anything is another matter, and one he never helped anyone answer. Shipman won a place at Leeds University Medical School, where he met Primrose Oxtoby, a window dresser's assistant he reportedly got to know on the bus into the city. They married in November 1966, and she was soon pregnant with the first of their 4 children. He graduated in 1970, trained at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire, and by 1974 had joined a general practice in Todmorden. He was 28, energetic, and by his colleagues' accounts unusually confident for what they call a junior doctor on the other side of the pond. Shipman seemed to have an extremely bright future ahead of him, and his patients liked him immediately. Unfortunately, though, this honeymoon period would be short-lived, and Dr. Shipman's dark side would emerge. Within about a year of arriving, Shipman began suffering blackouts, and he told his colleagues it was epilepsy. The truth emerged in 1975, when staff at the practice noticed irregularities in the prescriptions. Shipman had been writing prescriptions for pethidine, a synthetic opioid, in the names of his own patients, then intercepting the drugs and administering them to himself. Patients on his list had unknowingly served as paper cover for a doctor's bad habit. In retrospect, this may have been around the same time he started his most nefarious acts, but more on that shortly. When the partners confronted him, he reportedly begged for a second chance, and when they refused, he flew into a rage and dared them to force him out, which they did. He spent the closing months of 1975 being treated at the Retreat, a psychiatric hospital in York, and was discharged with advice to remain under supervision. In 1976, he was convicted of forgery and drug offenses and fined 600 pounds in relation to his crimes. And here's the part that might sound somewhat bizarre. Despite the severity of the offenses, his medical license was never revoked. It wasn't even temporarily suspended, with the ability to reinstate it once he successfully completed treatment and entered an ongoing program. He received a warning letter, and no formal restrictions were ever placed on his right to practice medicine. A doctor with a criminal conviction for forging prescriptions, an addiction, and a demonstrated willingness to use his own patients' names was free to do it again. Within 2 years, that's exactly what he did, and this time it seemed that he may have actually been on the straight and narrow, or at least he'd gotten better at hiding what he was doing. In 1977, Shipman joined the Donnybrook Medical Office in Hyde, a former cotton town on the eastern edge of Greater Manchester. He stayed for 15 years and built a reputation as one of the most dedicated family physicians in the area. Shipman then left in 1992 to open a solo practice, taking a crowd of loyal patients with him. By the late 90s, his list ran to more than 3,000 names, and his patients just called him Fred, which was his middle name. He made home visits without being asked, remembered birthdays, and took time with elderly patients that other doctors couldn't spare. In Hyde, getting onto Dr. Shipman's patient list was considered a stroke of good luck, at least until his true nature was exposed. The method, pieced together later in a courtroom and a public inquiry, was remarkably consistent. He'd call on an elderly patient at home, usually in the early afternoon and often unannounced, on the pretext of a routine check or a blood test. At some point during the visit, he'd inject a lethal dose of diamorphine, which is medical-grade heroin, and his patient would simply drift away in her chair. He kept himself supplied by prescribing the drug to terminally ill patients who didn't need that much of it, or by collecting leftover stock after a death. Afterward, he'd certify the death himself, typically attributing it to old age, a stroke, or coronary thrombosis. He'd assure the family that nothing could have been done, gently steered them away from requesting a post-mortem, and often suggest cremation. Shipman would even tell the families that the deceased had mentioned that they didn't want an autopsy and that they preferred a cremation. Sometimes it was true, but oftentimes it was just a means to destroy the evidence of his crimes. Since he was such a well-respected and beloved figure, the families generally just took what he said at face value. Then he'd return to his office and alter the patient's records, inserting fictitious symptoms and consultations to build a medical history that made the death look expected. He had devious little workarounds for awkward moments with the families, designed to let him slip through the net. In several cases described at his trial, he told relatives who arrived to find their mother gone that he'd already called an ambulance. He told them that he then canceled it when it became clear nothing could be done. The ambulance services had no record of any such calls, but as usual, nothing much was done. When a death needed a witness, he sometimes timed his lethal visits so that he could be the one to discover the body, or arrange to be present when someone else did. A later statistical audit commissioned after his conviction found that Shipman was recorded as present at, or shortly before, the deaths of his patients, at a rate more similar to a hospice doctor than a family physician. Unfortunately, though, nobody ran those numbers while it was happening, because nothing about any of it looked like crime at first glance. The system relies on family doctors to flag suspicious deaths of this nature, and in Hyde, the person doing the flagging was the one responsible for them. For somewhere between 2 and 3 decades, that single fact, as well as his charisma and good reputation, was the whole of his protection. By early 1998, people at the edges of the process had started to notice. At Frank Massey and Son, a local funeral parlor, Deborah Massey and her colleagues observed that they were burying or cremating a striking number of Dr. Shipman's patients. Across the road from his office, another doctor, Reynolds, noticed how often Shipman was asking her practice to countersign his cremation forms. This was a safeguard that requires a second, independent doctor. She did some rough arithmetic and found his numbers impossible to explain. Her own practice had several doctors and roughly 3 times as many patients. Yet Shipman, working alone, was certifying deaths at about the same absolute rate. In March 1998, she took her concerns to the local coroner, John Pollard, who referred the matter to Greater Manchester Police. What followed is one of the most criticized police investigations in modern British history. The inquiry was conducted quietly by a single detective inspector over a few weeks. Reynolds' calculations were never properly followed up on, and the medical records in question were never meaningfully examined. Nobody ran the routine check that would have surfaced Shipman's 1976 conviction for forging prescriptions to obtain opioids. In April, the matter was closed for lack of evidence, and the Shipman inquiry's second report later concluded that the investigation had been superficial at best. The cost of that failure can be counted precisely. Between the file closing and his arrest, 3 more women passed at his hands. But then, just like that, he decided to pull his most audacious crime yet, and this time, he was caught. Kathleen Grundy was about the closest thing Hyde had to a legitimate local celebrity. She'd served as mayor, ran charity lunches, kept her own cottage, and was described by nearly everyone as fitter than people 20 years younger. On the morning of June 24th, Shipman called at her home, ostensibly to take a blood sample for a study on aging. A few hours later, friends found her on the sofa, fully dressed. Shipman recorded the cause of death as old age. And then a will turned up, and this is where Shipman really hit the fan. A firm called Hamilton Ward had received a clumsily typed document, supposedly from Mrs. Grundy. In it, she left her entire estate of £386,000 to her doctor, Harold Shipman, and nothing whatsoever to her family. The will, dated June 9th, arrived at the firm on the very day she passed, and 6 days later came a second typed letter letting the lawyers know their new client was gone. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, happened to be a lawyer herself, and her own firm had always handled her mother's affairs. One look at the document told her everything. The typing was sloppy, the wording was strange, and the signature didn't match. Her mother had been meticulous her entire life, and this thing was anything but, and Woodruff started making inquiries of her own, then went to the police. This time the investigation landed with Detective Superintendent Bernard Posels, who grasped almost immediately what he might be looking at. On August 1st, 1998, Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed from the cemetery at Hyde Chapel, the first exhumation of what would become 12. Tissue samples revealed morphine at lethal levels, administered within hours of her death, in a woman with no prescription for it. A Brother typewriter recovered from Shipman's office matched the forged will, and his explanation, that Mrs. Grundy used to borrow it from him, convinced nobody. His fingerprint was on the document and his computer almost instantly betrayed him. The system kept an audit trail he apparently didn't know about, and it showed him creating backdated entries that painted Grundy as a morphine addict. Some of them were typed within hours of her passing, indicating what would later be known as a much wider pattern. He was arrested on September 7th, 1998, and once detectives started counting, things looked grim. Police reviewed dozens of recent deaths among Shipman's patients, exhumed further bodies, and eventually settled on the 15 strongest cases. All of them were women. All had died between 1995 and 1998, and every death certificate carried his signature. The trial opened at Preston Crown Court on October 5, 1999, with Shipman facing 15 counts related to the deaths and one for forging the will. The prosecution laid out the morphine findings from the exhumations, the falsified computer records with their time-stamped audit trail, and the forged will. His defense did what it could, attacking the toxicology by arguing that morphine readings from long-buried tissue couldn't be trusted. They also reminded the jury that not a single witness had ever seen him administer anything to anyone. Shipman himself spent days in the witness box, by turns condescending and evasive, correcting lawyers on medical terminology while explaining none of the evidence against him. He wouldn't even admit to falsifying the records, despite the fact that the computerized audit trail clearly showed that he had done so. In the end, he gave oral testimony for a total of 12 days and ended up alienating most of those who believed he was a kind family physician. That said, through all of it, a portion of Hyde simply refused to believe the charges, and some of his patients reportedly went on defending him right up to the verdict. The jury deliberated for 6 days, and on January 31st, 2000, they convicted him on every count. The judge imposed 15 life sentences and, perhaps unsurprisingly, recommended that he never be released. After the conviction, the question became how many people had actually perished at the hands of Dr. Shipman. The government appointed a high court judge to chair a public inquiry, and her team spent years combing through the deaths of Shipman's patients going back to the 1970s. The first report, published in July 2002, concluded that Shipman had slain at least 215 of his patients between 1975 and 1998. However, there was some difficulty ascertaining when exactly he began his crime spree, though it appeared clear that he had started slow and become more bold over the years. Roughly 4 out of 5 victims were women, and the oldest was 93, while the youngest confirmed victim was a man of 41. A later report from the inquiry, looking at his early hospital years in Pontefract, pushed the plausible total to around 250. That figure makes him, by some counts, the most prolific predator in recorded history. And unlike nearly every other name on that grim ledger, he did it in plain sight, in a respectable profession, over a quarter of a century, while his community thanked him for it. He never explained himself to anyone, and on the morning of January 13th, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell. He left no note expressing remorse to the families of his victims, and no answer to the question of why he did it.